In the summer of 1852, when the slave markets of New Orleans were choking with heat, humidity, and human misery, something happened that the city's oldest traders would remember for the rest of their lives. On a day that should have been no different from any other, another auction, another crowd, another row of trembling captives, an enslaved young man was led onto the platform who stunned the entire square into silence. Whispers rippled like a sudden wind through the crowd. Buyers who had spent decades appraising bodies with cold, mechanical precision found themselves frozen, unable to speak, unable to look away. He was unlike anything anyone had ever seen in those markets. A young man whose presence didn't simply draw attention, it shattered it. His features were so striking, so unnervingly flawless, that seasoned auctioneers lost their practiced rhythm. Women in the crowd gasped. Men leaned forward with a possessive hunger they couldn't fully explain. Even the guards escorting him were visibly uneasy, as though they had been standing too close to something they didn't understand. But his beauty wasn't what made him unforgettable. It was the fear, not his fear. He showed none. He stood with an unsettling calm, too composed for someone about to be bought and owned. It was the fear of the men selling him, the way their voices shook, the way they avoided looking directly at him, the way they rushed through the auction as if handling something dangerous, something that needed to be removed from their hands as quickly as possible. Rumors began before the bidding even started. Some said he had been found wandering alone after a violent storm that swept through a Louisiana plantation. Others whispered that he had no history at all, no record, no papers, no origin anyone could trace. The trader who brought him in refused to explain where he came from or how he obtained him, and the few who tried to question the young man himself claimed they felt a strange, unnerving sensation simply standing close to him, as if the air around him carried something heavy and ancient. Within minutes, the auction collapsed into chaos. A bidding war erupted so fast and so viciously that even the officials struggled to maintain control, and just when the price climbed high enough to ruin a small plantation, something happened. Something the city would argue about for years, something that made men swear they would never attend another auction again, because the most beautiful male slave ever sold in New Orleans was hiding a secret so impossible, so disturbing, that every man who tried to claim him would come to regret it. And by the end of that summer, not a single one of them would dare speak his name. The morning heat in New Orleans that day felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself knew something was about to happen. The slave market, normally a loud transactional space filled with shouting traders and restless buyers, buzzed with a strange tension that no one could quite place. It began subtly, people arriving earlier than expected, hushed conversations circling with an unusual urgency, glances tossed toward the back of the holding pens where something or someone was said to be waiting. Even men who had spent decades in the business, men who prided themselves on detecting valuable stock from a single glance, found themselves glancing toward the far gate with an uneasy anticipation they tried to hide. Rumors had trickled through the crowd before dawn about a young man brought in by a trader who refused to speak to anyone. Some said the trader was pale as a ghost when he arrived, muttering under his breath, avoiding eye contact and jumping at the slightest noise. Others claimed the man had brought the new slave in under a tarp, refusing to reveal his face until the exact moment of sale, something unheard of in a market that relied on physical display. Buyers assumed it was a tactic to inflate prices, but the trader's trembling hands and nervous glances suggested otherwise. By the time the bell rang to announce the first auction of the day, the crowd had swelled beyond its usual size, bodies pressing close, eager to confirm the whispers that were traveling faster than the humid breeze drifting off the river. Several seasoned buyers, planters, businessmen, men with reputations for cold rationality, found themselves pushing forward, driven by a curiosity that bordered on impatience. They didn't know why. They simply felt compelled. When the auctioneer stepped onto the platform, he cleared his throat twice before speaking, an uncharacteristic sign of nerves. The crowd quieted more quickly than usual, the silence folding over the market like a curtain dropping in a theater. The auctioneer glanced toward the gate, then toward the trader, who shook his head slightly as if urging him to hurry, and then the gate opened. For a moment, no one breathed. The young man who stepped into the light did not look like someone who had spent days or weeks in transit, shackled, dragged through the grime and brutality of the slave. His posture was unsettlingly straight, his expression calm, his steps steady in a way that made even the guards shift their grip on their batons. But it was his appearance, his face, that silenced the market in a way no auction had ever done. The traders who prided themselves on neutrality, on treating bodies as assets, froze. Women in the crowd instinctively touched their chests. Several men inhaled sharply, unable to hide their shock. The young man was striking in a way that defied explanation. His features were symmetrical with a precision that felt unnatural, as though carved by a hand too skilled to belong to anything mortal. His skin caught the light in a way that made him stand out even among hundreds of others who passed through the market every month. His eyes, a deep and steady shade that seemed to reflect more than they revealed, held an intensity that made people look away as soon as they met his gaze. Yet his beauty did not feel soft or delicate. There was something formidable beneath it, something that made even the boldest buyers hesitate before approaching. For a few long seconds the market remained frozen, every mind racing silently, every instinct conflicted. The auctioneer tightened his grip on the edge of the podium, swallowing hard as he tried to find his voice. He had seen thousands of slaves sold, had handled men twice this young and women whose value doubled plantations, yet he felt his throat tighten painfully. Something wasn't right. The crowd sensed it too. One buyer stepped forward, intending to inspect the young man as he would any other, but the moment he came within arm's reach, he stopped abruptly as if he had forgotten why he had walked in that direction. His eyes flicked to the young man's face, then away again, confusion briefly clouding his expression. He backed away without a word, shaking his head slightly. A murmur spread through the crowd, not a loud one. This was softer, more tentative, the sound of uncertainty rather than curiosity. Some people found themselves inexplicably uneasy, the hair rising on their arms without knowing why. Others felt an almost magnetic pull, an urge to be closer, to examine the young man carefully, to understand what made him so different, but none could fully articulate what they were feeling. The trader who had brought him stood rigid at the edge of the stage, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Sweat dripped down the side of his face despite the shade he stood in. When one of the officials approached him, presumably to ask about the young man's origin or documentation, the trader flinched, stepping back instinctively, insisting in a stuttering voice that the sale proceed quickly. That alone sent another ripple through the crowd. Traders never rushed. They stretched out auctions to maximize bids, to inflate tension, to increase the final price. But this man looked like he wanted the young man off his hands as soon as possible. Like holding on to him for even a moment longer was too dangerous to bear. The auctioneer, after what felt like an eternity, finally announced the beginning of the sale. His voice cracked on the first syllable, drawing startled glances from those who knew him to be a flawless performer. No one laughed. No one even smiled. Every eye was locked on the young man who stood calmly on the block, his face unreadable, showing no fear, no anger, no confusion, nothing that could be interpreted. That was perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. Slaves on the auction block trembled, they cried, they clenched their fists, they begged with their eyes even if they couldn't speak with their mouths. But this young man did none of that. He did not look resigned or defeated. He looked almost as though he were the one observing them, studying the crowd with an intelligence that made several people look away abruptly. The air grew heavier, the silence denser, and in that strange suspended moment before the first bid was placed, the entire market felt the same inexplicable sensation. A collective awareness that whatever was happening on that stage was not something ordinary, not something natural, and certainly not something any of them were prepared to understand. The mystery around the young man's origins began long before he stepped onto the auction block, long before the crowd quieted in stunned disbelief. It started the moment the trader arrived in New Orleans 2 days before the sale, driving a wagon that creaked as though it carried something far heavier than the single passenger hidden beneath the tarp. Men who worked the docks would later recall how the trader kept glancing over his shoulder, flinching at every unexpected sound, gripping the reins so tightly his fingers looked bloodless. He answered no questions, offered no greetings, and avoided anyone who tried to approach. When asked what he was hauling, he muttered only that it was special stock, a phrase traders often used to inflate curiosity. But the tremor in his voice betrayed none of the usual arrogance. Instead, it carried something closer to fear, as if he were transporting not a man but a secret he desperately wanted to rid himself of. When he reached the holding pens, he refused help unloading. Workers watched as he struggled to guide the young man, still covered, still hidden, into a private cell at the far end of the row. No one saw the new arrival's face, no one saw his hands or even his silhouette. The trader kept the tarp wrapped tightly, even as he chained the young man to the wall, sweating profusely as he worked. He didn't sleep that night. Those who passed by his campfire claimed he sat upright, staring at the cell door with wide, restless eyes, as though expecting something inside to break free. Every so often he muttered something to himself too softly to hear clearly, though one man swore he caught fragments of a phrase, "Shouldn't have taken him, shouldn't have agreed." By morning, rumors had already spread. Traders were territorial men, and a newcomer with unknown stock always drew attention. But the mystery of this arrival was different. No one could identify the plantation he came from. No overseer's letter, no bill of sale, no transfer records, nothing. In a business where documentation was constant, even obsessive. The absence of a paper trail was more than unusual. It was suspicious. When questioned, the trader gave short, halting answers. He claimed he had bought the young man from a small Louisiana estate along the river. Yet when asked for the name, he stuttered, then changed the subject. Another trader pressed him further, demanding proof, but the man became defensive, insisting that the paperwork had been lost on the road, a flimsy excuse that only deepened the curiosity surrounding the new captive. Still, he refused to open the cell or remove the tarp until the moment of sale. That secrecy became fuel for the whispers spreading through the market. Some said the young man might have escaped from a wealthy house and been quietly reclaimed, his true origins hidden to avoid scandal. Others suggested he was being smuggled from outside the state, bypassing taxes and documentation, a dangerous offense but not unheard of. A few, the more imaginative or superstitious among the workers, muttered stranger theories. They whispered that the young man had not been bought at all but found discovered wandering barefoot near a battered plantation home after a violent storm, untouched, uninjured, and unnervingly calm despite the devastation around him. They claimed the trader had first refused to take him, only to change his mind after the storm knocked out an entire row of slave quarters, leaving most of the enslaved dead or missing. The story was wild, unbelievable, clearly shaped by rumor rather than fact, yet it spread because no other explanation made sense. How could someone so unmarked, so composed, appear out of nowhere with no one willing or able to claim him? Other workers insisted they heard the trader speaking to someone inside the cell the night before the auction, though no reply was ever heard. They said his voice trembled as if he were pleading rather than commanding. One stable boy said he saw the trader's hands shaking as he locked the cell door, his face pale and drawn like a man returning from a grave rather than a simple holding pen. When the boy asked if he needed help, the trader snapped at him, an uncharacteristic burst of anger that quickly dissolved into an apology. The boy later said he had never seen a grown man look so terrified of someone who had not spoken a single word, and wordless he remained. In the days leading up to the auction, the private cell was unusually quiet. Most newly arrived slaves cried, begged, or whispered among themselves. Others shouted in defiance or prayed under their breath. But from the young man's cell came nothing. No movement, no muttering, no sound at all except the occasional soft scrape of chains. Several workers admitted they felt uneasy walking past the door, though none could explain why. One man described a strange sensation in his chest whenever he got too close, like standing near a storm that hadn't yet broken. Another said he avoided the cell entirely after the hair on his neck stood up each time he approached. The trader's fear only intensified as the auction day neared. He skipped meals, barely slept, and refused to let anyone else check on the captive. When the officials insisted on verifying the stock before the sale, he stalled, delayed, and argued until they threatened to cancel his registration. Even then, he would not allow them to see the young man. He partially lifted the tarp, revealing only the man's shoulders, posture, and jawline, enough to confirm he was healthy, but not enough to satisfy their curiosity. The officials protested, but the trader insisted that full exposure before the auction would cause trouble, a warning that made no sense until the day of the sale when the tarp finally came off. Rumors multiplied faster than they could be dismissed. Some claimed the young man was of mixed ancestry, hidden due to his unusually refined features. Others said he had been raised in a wealthy household, and had learned to carry himself with a dignity rare among captives. A few whispered the more outlandish theory that he wasn't a slave at all, but someone of high birth taken under mysterious circumstance. No two stories matched, and yet every version shared one detail. No one knew where he had come from, and the trader would rather lie, deflect, or grow visibly distressed than reveal the truth. By the morning of the auction, the sense of mystery surrounding the young man had transformed into something else, something heavier, more unspoken. People gathered not because they expected a high price or a rare skill, but because they sensed there was something extraordinary hidden behind that tarp. The trader's trembling only fueled the anticipation, making the crowd wonder what kind of person could instill such fear in a man who had likely handled hundreds of slaves before. And when the young man finally stepped onto the block, his appearance did nothing to calm the mystery. It deepened it in ways no one expected, confirming for many that whatever his origins were, they were nothing anyone had encountered in New Orleans before. From the moment the young man stood beneath the harsh sun of the auction yard, people sensed something was wrong in a way they couldn't name. It wasn't simply his beauty, though that alone was enough to unnerve even the most seasoned buyers. It was the strange calm that radiated from him, a calm that felt too deep, too deliberate, too composed for someone in chains about to be sold to an unknown master. He did not flinch when the crowd pressed closer. He did not recoil when hands reached toward him. He did not look afraid, angry, lost, or resigned. Instead, he stood with a quiet stillness, like someone who had already understood the outcome long before anyone else had even realized they were part of a story. His posture alone created a tension so intense the guards found themselves adjusting their grips and repositioning their stances, without fully understanding why. There was no tremor in his hands, no dryness at his lips, no heaviness in his breathing. Nothing about him resembled the physical tremble of a man facing purchase and ownership. Instead, he appeared to be observing the crowd with a composure that defied explanation. His eyes were steady, unblinking, moving slowly from face to face as if reading thoughts rather than expression. Those who met his gaze felt something they could not describe. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense. It was more like standing too close to something powerful and unknown, something that couldn't be understood through normal human measures. Some looked away immediately. Others found themselves unable to look away until the young man shifted his gaze elsewhere, relieving a pressure they hadn't realized was growing inside their chest. The more he remained calm, the more agitated the buyers became. Men who normally appraised enslaved bodies with the detachment of livestock inspection found themselves sweating and swallowing hard. A planter from Baton Rouge, known for his brutal confidence, stepped forward to examine the young man's arms, expecting the usual recoil or tension. Instead, the young man simply extended his arm with a smooth, controlled motion, neither submissive nor resistant. The planter touched his skin, then pulled his hand back abruptly, blinking as though startled by something he couldn't explain. When another buyer asked what was wrong, he shook his head without speaking, stepped backward and refused to come near again. No one could point to a single detail that made the young man's composure so disturbing, yet everyone felt it. It wasn't defiant. There was no anger simmering beneath the calm, nor was it trained obedience, the rigid posture drilled into certain household slaves. It was as though he was acting on a different set of expectations entirely, expectations that had nothing to do with slavery, auctions, or the hierarchy of the men around him. People sensed it instinctively, the unsettling feeling that the young man didn't belong in the market, not because of his beauty but because he seemed untouched by the fear and humiliation that defined it. His serenity made the others feel exposed and small, as if the entire scene was beneath his notice. The guards, who initially stood with their usual bored readiness, grew more alert as minutes passed. One guard attempted to push the young man's shoulder lightly to turn him toward the buyer. Most slaves would stumble, flinch, or brace themselves, but the young man moved with precise balance, turning exactly as much as needed, no more, no less. The guard hesitated, then stepped back, glancing at another guard with a look that suggested he had felt something strange in that brief moment of contact. When the young man was instructed to open his mouth, roll his shoulders, and raise his chin, all standard humiliating checks, he did so without hesitation, yet without the brokenness or sluggish submission most displayed. His movements were fluid, almost graceful, but not they were controlled in a way that made the buyers feel as though they were being evaluated, not him. A physician hired to inspect valuable auction stock approached him with a clinical coldness that annoyed many. He reached out to touch the young man's face, and though the young man allowed it, the physician froze the moment their eyes met. His hand hung in the air for a moment that lasted too long. Then he touched the young man's jawline as fast as if handling something dangerously hot. He completed the inspection quickly, avoiding eye contact, and later told no one what he had felt in that moment. But his hands trembled when he retied his bag, and he wiped sweat from his brow repeatedly, though the morning was still young. Some in the crowd whispered that the calmness came from madness, the glassy stillness of someone broken beyond feeling. But anyone who held that theory abandoned it the moment the young man turned his head or focused his gaze. There was intelligence in his eyes, sharp, present, measuring everything around him. Madness was chaos. He was quiet precision. Madness drifted. He was anchored. The difference was unmistakable. His silence did not feel like emptiness. It felt like knowledge being withheld. Others whispered that he had been groomed to behave this way, trained by a wealthy household to appear serene and obedient. But his demeanor held no hint of learned behavior. It felt intrinsic, not practical. A refined slave might show elegance, but they always betrayed small signs of tension: stiff shoulders, twitching fingers, the flicker of fear beneath the surface. This young man showed none of that. His calmness came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that unsettled the buyers because they could not imagine the experience or background that would produce such a disposition. It was not just his stillness that disturbed them. It was how unaffected he seemed by the collective attention, by the frenzy around him, by the hunger in the buyer's eyes. Most slaves avoided eye contact with the crowd out of fear or shame. Some glared defiantly. He did neither. He simply looked, not down, not away through. And each person who held his gaze felt as though the young man saw more than he should, as though he understood something about them they would never admit to anyone.
As he stood there, the crowd's reactions grew stranger. A few men who initially planned to bid stepped farther back without knowing why. Others, usually sharp-tongued and aggressive, found themselves unusually quiet, their confidence evaporating. A woman who had come with her husband clutched his sleeve, whispering that she felt uneasy, though she couldn't articulate what frightened her. Her husband dismissed her discomfort, yet he too stepped a little farther from the stage. The auctioneer, trying to regain control of the atmosphere, began announcing the young man's qualities with forced enthusiasm, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Every time he glanced at the young man, he seemed to lose his place for a second, as though forgetting what he was supposed to say. His pitch wavered, and he cleared his throat repeatedly, something he never did in front of a crowd. Even he, with decades of experience and thousands of sales behind him, seemed subtly shaken by the young man's presence. As the minutes stretched, the tension in the auction yard grew heavier, pressing on everyone in ways they couldn't define. No one knew why a calm, silent young man could make an entire market feel as though they were standing at the edge of something they weren't meant to witness, yet no one could deny it. His stillness was not weakness, nor was it pride. It was something else entirely, and the longer he stood there, the more every person felt a quiet dread they couldn't explain, a feeling that this man did not fit into the world they understood, and that something within him carried a depth they were never meant to confront.
When the auctioneer finally steadied himself enough to declare the bidding open, something in the air shifted with such force that several people instinctively straightened, as though bracing for impact. The first bid came from a wealthy sugar planter known for his cold efficiency and ruthless willingness to outprice his rivals. His voice rang out with confidence, but even he spoke more quickly than usual, as if compelled by an urgency he couldn't explain. Normally, the opening bid set the tone with a slow, measured progression. Buyers observed, calculated, weighed their options. But the moment his number left his lips, another bidder shouted a higher price. Almost immediately, his tone clipped, and desperate. Then a third. Then a fourth. The rapid escalation felt unnatural, like sparks catching on dry tinder, and within moments the market dissolved into a frenzy. Seasoned buyers who had never competed for the same slave suddenly found themselves driving the price higher with a kind of feverish determination. Some pushed forward so aggressively that the guards had to block them from stepping onto the platform. Others stood on tiptoe, necks craning, hands shaking as they lifted their bidding paddles. Their faces reddened, their voices cracked, and even those who had arrived with no intention to buy found themselves compelled to join the chaos. It was as if logic had been suspended, replaced by an overwhelming need to possess the young man whose quiet presence intensified rather than diminished the hysteria. The auctioneer tried to maintain order, but his voice was swallowed by the roars of competing bids. Assistants rushed to keep track of numbers, their hands moving frantically across their ledgers. One assistant dropped his chalk twice, his fingers trembling too hard to grip it properly. The crowd pressed closer, bodies grinding together, elbows digging in, breath coming heavy and fast. The air, thick already with heat, now felt suffocating. The bidding rose to sums that would bankrupt smaller planters, yet no one slowed. They shouted over one another, each bid becoming more aggressive, more reckless, as though something unseen was pulling at their desires, intensifying them with unnatural force. Some buyers looked stunned by the numbers they were offering, yet they continued anyway. A plantation owner who had just sold half his land to cover debts yelled a figure that made his own wife gasp, clutching his arm in disbelief. He shook her off without even looking at her. His eyes were focused solely on the young man standing silently at the center of the chaos, watching the scene unfold with the same unsettling composure he had held all morning. His face did not change, but something in the intensity of his gaze made the frantic bidding feel even more surreal. One man shoved another so hard that he stumbled into a wooden post, splitting his eyebrow open. Instead of stopping the fight, the wounded man scrambled back up, blood dripping down his cheek, and shouted a higher number with rage-fueled desperation. The auctioneer tried to regain authority, pounding his gavel with trembling hands, but even he seemed caught between awe and fear. He kept glancing at the young man with wide, uncertain eyes, as though questioning whether this frenzy was something he had somehow caused merely by standing there. A few buyers, the older and more observant ones, stepped back from the crowd, their faces pale. They whispered to each other that something was wrong, deeply wrong. They spoke of strange feelings curling in their stomachs, of thoughts that felt too loud, too urgent. One elderly trader muttered that he had never seen anything like this in 40 years, not even during the rare sales of highly trained or unusually skilled slaves. He clutched the edge of a post as if steadying himself against a wave of dizziness, insisting quietly that the young man's presence felt like a weight pressing on his mind. He refused to bid. He refused to stand any closer. The frenzy intensified until it bordered on violence. Several men argued so fiercely that guards intervened to separate them, pushing bodies apart with the flat ends of their batons. But even the guards struggled to maintain control. One guard shouted for order, but his voice trembled, betraying the fact that he too felt the strange intensity swirling through the yard. The other guard kept glancing nervously at the young man, as though something about him made the chaos feel more dangerous than any auction he had ever worked. The women in the crowd reacted strangely as well. Some seemed entranced, staring at the young man with a fascination they didn't attempt to hide. Others looked increasingly distressed, covering their mouths or gripping their shawls tightly, whispering to their husbands that they needed to leave. Yet none of them actually moved away. Every attempt to step back was countered by another glance, another moment of contact with the young man's unsettlingly calm eyes, freezing them in place, as though pinned by some invisible force. A merchant from Mississippi, who had never bid in New Orleans before, shouted a figure so high that the entire yard fell silent for a moment. Even the birds resting on the beams above seemed to pause. The number was enormous, enough to buy an entire plantation. Someone in the back gasped. Someone else cursed under their breath. The merchant looked shaken, as if unsure whether he had spoken voluntarily or whether the number had been pulled out of him by something he couldn't name. Before the auctioneer could confirm the bid, another man doubled it. Double. The sheer absurdity of the number sent another ripple of stunned disbelief through the crowd. People stared at the bidder as if he had lost his mind. Sweat streamed down his temples, his breath quickened, and his eyes gleamed with a wild, feverish hunger that made even those closest to him step away. His wife fainted. Someone splashed water on her, but she didn't stir. Even then no one stopped bidding. The frenzy continued, spiraling beyond any semblance of reason. The auctioneer's strained attempts to impose order faltered again and again as the crowd surged forward with a collective desperation that defied every rule of the trade. And through it all the young man remained unshaken, unmoved, his calm presence somehow amplifying the madness in those around him. Every shout, every gasp, every frantic gesture seemed to revolve around him, as if the entire market had been pulled into an orbit they couldn't escape. The bidding became less about ownership and more about something primal, something deeper, driven by a need no one understood. And while the numbers soared, while voices cracked, while bodies pressed dangerously close, the young man at the center of it all stood silently, watching with unwavering gaze of someone who had seen this chaos long before it began, and had known all along that it would happen exactly this way. The growing unease that spread among those who claimed to have encountered the strange figure was not born from loud threats or displays of violence, but something far quieter, something that seemed to seep into the air whenever he appeared, creating an atmosphere so unnerving that even the most hardened individuals felt their instincts twitch. People described the same sensation even though they never spoke to one another about it directly: a pull in the stomach, a tightening in the chest, an awareness that something was deeply out of balance. It wasn't fear in the usual sense, not fear of being attacked or harmed, but fear of the unknown, fear of what could not be explained, and fear of what the mind could not rationalize. This fear grew stronger each day, feeding on whispers, feeding on speculation, feeding on the way people's voices dropped whenever they spoke about him. Even the bravest masters, who prided themselves on breaking the wills of those under them, felt an uncomfortable sense of being observed in a way they couldn't understand. As people continued to talk, the descriptions became increasingly consistent. They said he moved like someone who carried no weight, as though his feet only touched the ground enough to show that he was still tethered to the earth. They said he could stand still in a way that made others feel like time around him slowed down. The silence that surrounded him was unlike normal quiet. It felt thick, heavy, almost as if the world around him was muffled. Some believed that he carried secrets no one else should hear. Others thought he could see through people in ways they couldn't explain. The stories grew, merging into something that seemed larger than the man himself. The fear, once a low hum, became a steady pulse that everyone could feel. The more people avoided him, the more they talked about him, and their stories intertwined in ways that made it difficult to tell what was truth and what was rumor. Some claimed that animals reacted violently in his presence, refusing to go near him or suddenly bolting as if something invisible had startled them. Others insisted the opposite, that certain animals calmed around him, as though recognizing something familiar within him that people could not. Both versions of the story spread, and both added to the confusion. Every inconsistency only made people more nervous, because unpredictability is its own kind of terror. No one knew what to expect, and humans fear most what they cannot anticipate. At night, in dimly lit kitchens or quiet corners of porches, people whispered theories they would never have dared to say aloud in public. Some said he wasn't entirely human,
that something had changed him long before he arrived. Others believed he had encountered something unexplainable, an event, a person, a moment, that left a permanent mark on him. A few insisted he was cursed, carrying a shadow with him that stretched further than the one cast by the sun. These theories were spoken with nervous laughter, but the laughter faded quickly as people remembered the feeling they had when he walked past them, that subtle but undeniable sensation that the world tilted for a heartbeat. Those who had tried to confront him even indirectly found themselves at a loss. They expected resistance, or anger, or fear, but instead they were met with nothing. Nothingness was far worse than retaliation. They tried to provoke him, to force a reaction, to understand what they were dealing with, but he remained unshakably calm. No matter how harsh the words or how threatening the tone, his expression didn't change. He listened, if listening was even the right word, and then moved on as though nothing had happened. That calmness frightened them more than any outburst could have. It was unnatural in a place where people were used to seeing desperation, defiance, or hopelessness. Calmness meant something else was happening beneath the surface, something they could not access or understand. The fear people felt soon began to affect their decisions. Some avoided walking down certain paths at certain times, altering their routes to ensure they wouldn't cross. Others refused to be alone in the same room with him, finding excuses to leave or to bring someone else with them. Even those who pretended to be above superstition found themselves watching him from the corner of their eye, studying him with caution, trying to see what it was that made everyone so unsettled. But no matter how closely they watched, they found no sign that explained anything. Their confusion only fed their anxiety. People began to question his past, searching for any record, any scrap of information that could help them piece together who he was before all of this. But the more they searched, the more they found themselves confronted with gaps. He seemed to appear from nowhere, with no one able to confirm where he came from, who his family was, or what his life had been before. This absence of history created even more uncertainty. A person without a past is a mystery, and a mystery is often more frightening than the truth. No matter how dark the truth may be, without answers, the imagination fills in the void, and imagination tends to create things far worse than reality. Yet the most unsettling part was that none of the fear seemed to touch him. He moved through his days as if unaffected by the emotions swirling around him. People expected that he would show some awareness of the effect he had on others, maybe even confusion or concern, but there was nothing. This only deepened the sense that something about him existed outside the normal boundaries of human behavior. He became a quiet presence that dominated every space without saying a word, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful force is the one that doesn't speak, doesn't act, and doesn't reveal its intentions. And the more people tried to make sense of him, the further the truth slipped away, leaving only more questions, more fear, and more tension simmering beneath the surface. The auctioneer and the trader had both worked long enough in New Orleans to know that certain types of people required careful handling. Experienced buyers, hardened overseers, and wealthy planters were rarely unsettled by anything except the threat of losing money. Yet from the moment the young man appeared on the block, the air itself seemed to warn of danger. The secret that both men tried to hide was not simply that he was unusually beautiful or calm. It was far darker, far more disturbing than anyone could imagine. A secret rooted in the experiences of the men who had attempted to claim him before reaching the city. Stories circulated quietly at first, whispers between traders in back rooms, exchanged in the hush of early mornings or over cups of coffee before the auction began. But the tales carried a weight, a grim consistency that made even seasoned professionals hesitate to speak them aloud. According to the few who dared, the young man's previous masters, wherever they had been, had all met with mysterious misfortune. Some claimed that men who had tried to assert complete control over him found themselves struck with illness, a fever or sudden collapse that left them bedridden. Others said that accidents occurred around them, falls, equipment breaking in impossible ways, horses bolting or wagons tipping over without warning. There were mentions of duels ending in tragedy, of disputes turning fatal when he was present. No single story could be verified, and yet the pattern was unmistakable to those who listened carefully. Anyone who tried to dominate him completely did not remain unscathed. The trader who brought him to New Orleans carried these stories with him, though he rarely shared them, and when he did, his voice would drop to a whisper, as if speaking louder might summon consequences he did not dare face. The auctioneer too felt the weight of the secret. He had witnessed countless auctions in his life, seen countless sales go smoothly and others descend into chaos over simple disputes or poor planning, but he had never encountered a case like this. The young man's presence seemed to warp the usual order of the sale. The auctioneer noticed how men who attempted to get too close were distracted, how their bids escalated beyond reason, and how minor injuries or slips occurred with unnerving frequency. He tried to explain it away as coincidence, but every instinct in his body screamed that something else was at play, and in his heart he knew that revealing the rumors about previous masters would not calm the crowd, it would terrify. As the auction began, these whispers took on a life of their own. The bidding war became more than just a contest of money, it became a contest of courage, a test of who could withstand the invisible force that seemed to radiate from the young men. Men shouted numbers that would bankrupt them without hesitation. Others, previously confident in their ability to control the market, found themselves shrinking back, their voices caught in their throats. No one dared discuss the prior misfortunes openly, but those familiar with the rumors recognized the patterns. A man who bid too aggressively seemed suddenly overconfident, only to fumble his papers, trip or miscalculate. Another would lean too close to inspect him, and stumble back as if recoiling from a hidden threat. Every movement, every reaction seemed to confirm the unspoken warnings. The more people tried to ignore these patterns, the more pronounced they became. Even those who were skeptical, who refused to believe in curses or supernatural influence, could not deny the strangeness of the events surrounding the young man. He moved with precision, but it was a precision that somehow disrupted the expectations of those around him. Their usual tactics, inspections, provocations, whispered negotiations failed to yield the control they expected. Instead, each attempt to dominate or predict his behavior was met with subtle but unmistakable consequences. Slips, minor injuries, sudden distractions, moments of disorientation that left them uncertain and hesitant. Every incident fed the growing sense of unease, reinforcing the traders' and auctioneers' determination to keep the more extraordinary rumors from the public ear. Those who had tried to investigate him before arriving in New Orleans offered only fragmented stories. One account suggested that a wealthy planter had attempted to keep him under strict surveillance for several days. The planter reportedly grew increasingly ill and paranoid, convinced that the young man was watching him, learning his thoughts, predicting his every move. Another story told of a man who had tried to assert physical dominance, only to experience a series of inexplicable accidents that ruined his property and threatened his life. Each anecdote was laced with fear and fascination, but there was no concrete proof, only the consistent memory of discomfort and misfortune attached to those who crossed him too forcefully. The trader who transported him to New Orleans had heard these stories from various sources, and the consistency was enough to convince him that the young man's presence carried real danger, even if no one could fully understand it. The young man himself, however, revealed nothing. He did not acknowledge the whispers, did not react to the caution or fear that surrounded him, and did not display anger or resentment at the chaos his mere presence incited. His silence was part of the secret, part of the aura that made others question whether he was human in the conventional sense. He moved and stood, spoke when necessary, but never confirmed or denied the rumors swirling around him. And in that silence, the traders and auctioneer found themselves powerless. Their authority and experience, normally enough to control an entire auction, suddenly seemed irrelevant, as if they were participants in a larger drama they could not direct. As the bidding war escalated, the auctioneer tried to maintain order, but the stories of past misfortune hovered in every mind. Buyers recognized the subtle patterns, the quickening of heartbeat, the sudden lapse in focus, the inexplicable errors in calculation, and feared what might happen if they pressed too far. They knew from the rumors that men who attempted to assert full control over the young man often paid a price, though the exact nature of that price was unclear. The market became a delicate balancing act. How much could they push? How far could they go without triggering disaster? And who among them would succumb first to the unseen force that seemed to shadow him? Even as the auction proceeded, some observers tried to decipher what had happened to his previous masters. Some believed the misfortune was punishment for cruelty, a natural consequence of trying to break someone who could not be broken. Others thought the young man himself possessed a subtle power, an intelligence that allowed him to manipulate the world around him in ways no one could measure. Both interpretations carried an element of dread, because either implied that interacting with him carried a danger beyond human understanding. The auctioneer and trader both knew that acknowledging these possibilities openly would drive the crowd into panic, possibly halting the auction entirely. They worked in tense silence, their own fear heightened by their knowledge of what could happen to those who underestimated the young man. Rumors of the prior attempts to claim him grew with every retelling, becoming almost folklore among the traders. Some whispered that the young man had been held by men of great wealth who suddenly lost fortunes or families in inexplicable accidents. Others spoke of mysterious illnesses that claimed those who tried to restrain him too harshly. Every version of the story added layers of fear, making it almost impossible to separate truth from exaggeration. But the effect was the same. The young man's presence became an instrument of psychological power, a force that shaped the actions of everyone around him even before a single coin changed hands. And in that tense environment, the auctioneer and trader worked tirelessly to manage appearance, conceal the most extraordinary rumors, and prevent the crowd from realizing just how impossible the young man's secret truly was. The day of the auction had already stretched into an almost unbearable tension, and yet the most terrifying moment for the crowd was yet to come, as the bids escalated higher and higher, reaching sums that would have bankrupted even the wealthiest planters. An event occurred that none of the onlookers could have anticipated. It was subtle at first, something almost imperceptible, a change in the young man's demeanor. He shifted his weight slightly, a minor adjustment so small that most would not have noticed. Yet for those paying close attention, it felt like the air itself had thickened, as though the temperature of the entire yard had changed in a single heartbeat. The wind that had been blowing lightly through the streets seemed to stop entirely. The chatter of the crowd diminished to murmurs, and even the birds on the beams above fell silent, tilting their heads in a way that suggested awareness. No one spoke, no one breathed. The auctioneer froze mid-sentence, chalk hovering over the board, unsure whether to continue, whether the bidding could safely proceed. And then it began. Objects in the market yard started moving in strange and inexplicable ways. A table holding ledgers wobbled violently, sending papers scattering across the dirt floor. One bidder, reaching for his paddle, tripped over a misplaced rope and fell hard, his shout echoing sharply through the sudden quiet. Another man, leaning too close to inspect the young man, suddenly swore as a chair leg snapped beneath him. These incidents were minor, seemingly coincidental, but the pattern was unmistakable. They all occurred around him, all in moments of direct attention, and each event sent a shiver through the crowd. People whispered that this was no accident, that there was something unnatural about the young man, though no one could articulate exactly what it was. The auctioneer, desperate to regain control, banged the gavel again and tried to speak over the mounting chaos. His voice sounded weak and strained, breaking on words that would normally carry authority. Buyers called out numbers, but the bidding no longer followed normal pattern. Men who had been in the lead suddenly called out far lower numbers than they had intended, while others who had not been in contention shouted absurdly high bids without any logical reason. Some raised their voices in panic, some in fury, but all were responding to an unseen force, a compulsion that none of them understood. The young man, standing perfectly still, observed the scene with an unsettling calm that only amplified the chaos around him. Then came the most dramatic incident. A wealthy planter, known for his stubbornness and audacity, stepped forward to claim the young man, waving his hands and calling a number that exceeded everyone else's. As he did, a sudden commotion erupted behind him. A large crate stacked carefully against the side of the market toppled over, narrowly missing several spectators. The planter spun around instinctively to avoid it, lost his balance, and fell hard against the wooden railing of the auction stage. The crowd gasped and recoiled, unsure whether to rush to his aid or maintain their distance. The planter scrambled to his feet, flushed with embarrassment and rage, but his confidence had been shattered. He hesitated, and the moment he did, another bidder shouted a higher amount, seizing the advantage. Throughout all this, the young man's expression remained unreadable. He did not intervene, did not react, did not offer even the slightest acknowledgement that he had witnessed the event. Yet everyone around him sensed a connection, an unspoken influence. It was as if the chaos itself responded to his awareness, responding to his presence as though he were the center of a force field that no one could touch without consequence. The effect was cumulative. Each new misstep, each abrupt movement, each panicked shout heightened the sense of dread in the crowd. Even those who had been confident and composed only moments before now glanced nervously at the young man, questioning their own instincts and their ability to safely complete the bidding. Stories later claimed that objects continued to shift and sway in strange ways, as though the air around him was charged with a subtle but undeniable energy. Coins slipped from hands, ledgers fell, ropes twined around themselves, and doors slammed shut without a breeze to push them. The physical disturbances were minor but numerous, enough to unnerve anyone witnessing them, and no one could argue that they were random. Even the guards, normally stalwart and imposing, seemed hesitant to move, glancing frequently at the young man, as though seeking silent permission for every action. The more the bidding intensified, the more pronounced these incidents became. Men shouted higher sums in erratic bursts, some attempting to regain control, others driven by an inexplicable compulsion to participate, to possess, to outbid. The logic of trade, the careful calculations of worth and value that usually governed auctions, was entirely absent. Each number was a response to instinct, impulse and fear rather than reason. Buyers who had prided themselves on rationality found themselves unable to calculate, unable to strategize, unable to stop themselves from competing even against their own better judgment. It was as though the young man's presence had rewritten the rules entirely, creating an invisible force field that compelled action and discouraged restraint. At one point, two men nearly came to blows over a bit. One raised his cane aggressively, only to stumble back as the young man shifted slightly, causing the floorboards to creak underfoot in a way that made him lose balance. The other bidder caught himself just in time, and both men glared at one another with frustration and fear rather than triumph. Around them, the crowd surged forward instinctively, trying to maintain a safe distance from potential conflict while simultaneously leaning closer to witness what was happening. The paradox of fear and fascination created a pressure cooker atmosphere, one that seemed poised on the brink of disaster at any given moment. Even the auctioneer, whose role was normally to command attention and assert order, struggled to regain control. His gavel shook in his hands, his voice faltered, and the notes of the ledger slipped repeatedly as he tried to record bids. He had never seen an auction descend into such chaos, and the explanation for the events eluded him entirely. Buyers, spectators and assistants alike became participants in a collective confusion, each reacting instinctively to the disturbances, while simultaneously attempting to understand them. The young man's calm in the center of the chaos only amplified the tension, as if his serenity was both the cause and the explanation for everything that was happening. The crescendo of the event reached its apex when the highest bid of the morning was shouted by a man who had been silent for much of the auction. The air seemed to tighten around him as he called the figure, and in that moment a sudden crash echoed from the back of the market yard. A pile of crates, carefully stacked and forgotten, fell in a domino effect, striking the wooden fence and sending dust and splinters into the air. Spectators screamed and jumped back instinctively. The bidder who had shouted the number froze, his eyes wide, chest tight, and the sound of his own heartbeat suddenly deafening in his ears. Through all of this, the young man remained composed, a calm observer in the epicenter of chaos. His stillness contrasted sharply with the disorder around him, drawing attention like a magnet. The crowd's energy, frantic, fearful and desperate, swirled around him but never touched him directly. Every person in the yard felt an invisible force that dictated their movements, decisions, and even thoughts, as though his presence had become the axis around which their reality spun. The earlier whispers about his previous masters, about misfortune and inexplicable events, seemed suddenly plausible. Every disrupted object, every misstep, every heightened emotion suggested that those tales were not exaggeration but warning.
By the time the chaos had reached its full intensity, the market had transformed into something unrecognizable. The auction was no longer simply a contest of money. It had become a theater of fear and fascination, a demonstration of influence and power that could not be quantified. People's actions were unpredictable, their thoughts scattered, their focus entirely consumed by the young man's presence. It was clear to all who witnessed it that this was not an ordinary auction, and that the consequences of interacting with the young man were far beyond the normal understanding of human behavior. The final keynote centers on the aftermath of the auction, and the lasting impact of the young man's presence on everyone who witnessed it. From the moment the gavel finally came down, sealing the sale, the air remained thick with tension and disbelief. Buyers, traders, and onlookers alike felt as though they had been part of something extraordinary, something that would not be forgotten. Even those who had initially come expecting a routine transaction found themselves reflecting on what had occurred, questioning their perceptions, their instincts, and their understanding of human nature. The young man, for his part, remained unshaken, stepping down from the block with the same calm, deliberate movements that had defined his entire presence. His composure, so unnerving in the moment, seemed now almost deliberate, as if he understood fully the effect he had on those around him and chose to maintain it without a single word. People whispered among themselves about what they had witnessed. Some were convinced that the young man possessed a kind of power that could not be explained by ordinary means. Others suggested that he carried with him knowledge, cunning, and intelligence far beyond what anyone in the market could imagine. Even skeptics who had laughed at the rumors prior to the auction found themselves questioning their disbelief. The events of the day, the frenzied bidding, the strange accidents, the inexplicable influence over people's actions could not be rationalized easily. It was as though the very rules of the market, the conventions of trade, and the assumptions of human behavior had been suspended, if only briefly, by the presence of one young man who refused to conform. For the buyers who had participated, the experience was transformative. Men who had arrived confident and composed left the market unsettled and introspective. Many avoided speaking of the events openly, perhaps out of fear of sounding foolish, but in private they recounted every detail with meticulous care. They debated the reasons behind the chaos, the pattern of influence, and the nature of the young man's calm demeanor. Some attributed the events to luck or coincidence, but no one could deny the intensity of the psychological pressure he had exerted. Others speculated on his origins, wondering how a person could emerge from obscurity with such presence, such control, and such effect on those around him. Each hypothesis was as plausible as it was impossible, leaving everyone in a state of suspended reasoning, caught between fascination and dread. The traders involved were similarly affected, though their concerns were less philosophical and more practical. They had never handled stock that inspired such fear and uncertainty. The events of the auction challenged their understanding of risk, value, and the limits of human behavior. Some considered whether they should have prevented the sale altogether, worried that the young man's influence might continue to ripple outward, affecting others in unpredictable ways. Others argued that his rarity, combined with his mysterious abilities, made him the most valuable slave any of them had ever encountered. The paradox of fear and profit created tension not easily resolved, and for days after the sale, traders would quietly debate the ramifications of what they had witnessed, always circling back to the central question: what was it about him that caused such extraordinary outcome? Even the spectators, those who had come merely to observe, felt the weight of the day's events long after leaving the market. Many described dreams in which the young man appeared, silent and watching, his calm eyes following their movement. Some admitted to friends and family that they had felt an unexplainable pull during the auction, a compulsion to participate in the bidding or to watch every motion closely. Others experienced lingering unease, an inability to focus, or sudden apprehension when encountering similar crowds or markets in the following weeks. The young man's presence had left a psychological imprint, subtle but enduring, on anyone who had witnessed him, altering their perception of human interaction and influence in ways that could not be easily articulated. The narrative surrounding the young man's origins and abilities continued to evolve. Storytellers in New Orleans and beyond seized upon the extraordinary events, embellishing details to suit their audiences while preserving the core truth that this young man, who should have been another anonymous figure in the market, had altered the behavior of everyone around him simply by existing in the space. Some claimed he had been raised in isolation, trained to master human psychology before being brought to market. Others suggested he had encountered forces, spiritual, intellectual, or otherwise, that granted him the ability to manipulate perception and reaction. Each version contributed to the growing legend, further blurring the line between reality and myth, and ensuring that the young man's name would persist long after the day itself. What also became clear was the young man's awareness of the effect he never revealed it, yet the subtlety of his movements, the precision of his gaze, and the consistency of his composure suggested intentionality. He did not need to speak or act dramatically. The mere act of standing, observing, and responding just enough to guide perception was sufficient to control the entire environment. This understanding, implicit in his behavior, elevated him above the ordinary, positioning him not as a participant in the human hierarchy, but as an orchestrator of its perception, capable of shaping actions and decisions without overtly intervening. Over time, those who had witnessed the auction began to reinterpret their own actions. Many realized that the behavior they had exhibited, shouts, gestures, impulsive bids, physical reactions, had not been entirely voluntary. It was influenced, subtly but undeniably, by the young man's presence and by the strange energy he projected. This revelation prompted a combination of fear and admiration, as they acknowledged the rare intelligence and subtlety required to command attention without speaking or enforcing obedience. They speculated endlessly about the mechanisms of his influence, the origins of his calm, and the potential consequences for anyone who might encounter him in the future. The auction itself became a reference point for extraordinary events in New Orleans. People spoke of it in hushed tones, especially among those who dealt with human commerce regularly. It was cited as evidence that some individuals possessed qualities that could transcend conventional understanding, that human presence alone could disrupt social order and provoke extreme emotional and physical responses. The young man's beauty, while remarkable, was secondary to the profound psychological and social impact he had generated. Traders, buyers, and spectators alike understood that they had witnessed a phenomenon beyond mere physical appearance, a convergence of composure, perception, and presence so precise that it altered reality around him. Even after leaving the market, the young man's legend continued to spread, taking on layers of interpretation. Some described him as an enigma, a figure whose calm presence masked untold depths of knowledge or ability. Others treated him almost as a cautionary tale, a reminder that appearances could conceal extraordinary power. Families recounted the story at dinner tables, friends whispered it in quiet corners, and those who had bid against him carried the memory as a persistent reminder of their own vulnerability in the face of forces they could neither control nor predict. The psychological impression he left was in some ways more lasting than the physical transaction itself. Ultimately, the young man's effect was measured not by the price he fetched or by the immediate success of the auction, but by the enduring impression he left on human behavior, perception and memory. The market, the crowd and the individuals involved had all been altered, subtly yet profoundly, by his presence. Everyone who had been there understood that what they had experienced defied ordinary explanation, that the world as they knew it had been temporarily suspended, or reshaped, and that the young man himself was the axis around which that suspension occurred. His silence, his stillness, and his awareness became as powerful as any spoken command, creating an influence that would ripple outward in ways impossible to quantify, marking the day as unforgettable and setting the stage for stories that would endure long after the auction ended. As the crowd dispersed and the echoes of the auction faded into the dusty streets of New Orleans, one thing became undeniably clear. The young man was no ordinary slave, no ordinary human being subjected to the whims of others. He had entered the marketplace not as property, but as a force, an enigma whose presence unsettled, controlled and mesmerized simultaneously. The wealthiest planters, the most cunning trader and the hardened spectators alike left forever altered, carrying with them the lingering awareness that power is not always wielded through dominance or violence. It can exist quietly, invisibly in a gaze, in a posture, in the serene certainty of a person who refuses to be contained. His beauty had drawn attention, but it was his impossible composure, his unshakable calm, and the mysterious energy that radiated from him that left an indelible mark on history. In the years that followed, whispers of his existence became legend. Some said he vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, slipping from city to city, leaving those who encountered him with the same mixture of awe, fear, and fascination. Others claimed he continued to appear in the lives of men who thought themselves invincible, subtly reminding them that control is never absolute, that true power often lies in the quiet, in the unseen, and in the minds of those who are underestimated. What the world would never forget was the day when a single young man bound in chains yet unbound in presence, turned the conventions of a marketplace upside down, challenging every assumption about fear, obedience and influence. He became a living testament to the idea that some secrets are too powerful, too profound, to be tamed, and that sometimes the most extraordinary strength resides not in what is done, but in what is simply endured and observed. No matter how time marched forward, or how countless stories were told and retold, the impossible secret of the most beautiful male slave ever auctioned in New Orleans endured, a haunting reminder that some people, in their quietest moments, possess a force that changes everyone around them forever.